Hello GlitterBugs! Welcome to another video. I hope you're doing really well. So in today's video, we are going to be listening to a few short stories about spooky Squishmallows. They're original short stories created by yours truly. So let me know what you think of them. While we listen to the stories, we are going to be going through some of my favorite Halloween Squishmallows. Without any further ado, happy Halloween, happy spooky season, and I hope you enjoy today's spooky Halloween Squishmallows storytime video. It was a rainy October night when Abby, Jenna, and Mark found themselves huddled in their living room, scrolling through horror forums. They were paranormal enthusiasts to chase thrills online rather than in real life. That all changed when they stumbled upon a post about the Squishmallow haunt. "Guys, listen to this," Abby said, her eyes wide as she read aloud. "There's this old toy factory outside of town, abandoned for years. The owner disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and now the place is haunted by his last creations, Squishmallows. But they're not ordinary plush toys. Supposedly, these ones move on their own. People who go in say they hear giggles and whispers. Some even claim that the Squishmallows have a life of their own, like they're alive." Mark scoffed. "Squishmallows? The cute, fluffy toys everyone collects? Yeah, right. How scary can they be?" But Jenna leaned in, intrigued. "There's more," she said, scrolling through the comments. "Apparently, the factory used to mass-produce Squishmallows for a Halloween line, but something went wrong. Some say the owner cursed the batch before he vanished, and now they're possessed." "Haunted Squishmallows," Abby repeated with a smirk. "Only one way to find out if it's true. We go there." Mark rolled his eyes, but he wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Jenna, always fascinated by the paranormal, was already grabbing her camera. With a few flashlights, some snacks, and their phones fully charged, they decided to head out to the factory. After all, it wasn't too far, a 30-minute drive at most. As they approached the factory, the rain intensified, hammering against the car window. The building was enormous, looming against the dark sky like a giant skeleton of a past era. Its windows were broken, and the sign out front had long since faded, though you could still make out the faint letters of Squishmallows. "This is way creepier than I thought," Mark muttered as they stepped out of the car, flashlight beams cutting through the downpour. The factory doors were rusted and heavy, but with a bit of effort, they managed to pry them open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The walls were lined with shelves, and here and there, old, discarded Squishmallows sat slumped over, covered in grime. Their once vibrant colors were now dull, their plush bodies deflated from years of neglect. But there was something off about the air, something electric, like they weren't alone. "Let's check out the production floor," Jenna suggested, her camera already rolling. "That's where they said most of the activity happens." They made their way deeper into the factory, their footsteps echoing eerily off concrete floors. As they entered the main production area, the temperature seemed to drop. Conveyor belts sat still, covered in a layer of dust, and large machines loomed in the darkness like ancient beasts. But what caught their attention was the pile of Squishmallows in the center of the room, hundreds of them, stacked haphazardly as though someone had abandoned them in a hurry. "Those must be from the cursed batch," Abby whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain pounding against the factory walls. Jenna approached the pile, kneeling down to get a closer look with her camera. They still looked pretty new except for the dust. She picked up one, a black cat with orange eyes, definitely Halloween-themed. "This one's kind of cute." Mark wandered off to inspect one of the machines, brushing away cobwebs. "I don't see anything paranormal," he called back. "Maybe the cursed is just—" Suddenly, the Squishmallow in Jenna's hands twitched. She froze, staring at the plush toy in disbelief. "Guys, did you see that?" Mark laughed. "Nice try, Jenna. You're not scaring me with some plushie." But Abby had seen it too. "I swear it moved." Before Mark could brush them off, a soft, eerie giggle filled the air. It was faint, almost like a child's laughter, and it seemed to be coming from all around them. "Okay, I heard that," Mark said, his voice tense. Abby stepped back, her flashlight beam flickering. This is starting to feel wrong." Jenna stood up, but as she did, the pile of Squishmallows began to shift. The plush toys were moving. slowly at first, then more violently. One by one, they tumbled off the pile, landing on the floor with soft, muffled thuds. But instead of lying still, they started to crawl, dragging themselves across the floor toward the group. "Mark, Jenna, run!" Abby yelled, but before they could move, the lights in the factory flickered and went out, plunging them into total darkness. Their flashlights flickered too, casting erratic beams that barely cut through the black. The giggling grew louder, more sinister, echoing off the walls. Squishmallows, hundreds of them, were now scurrying across the floor, their soft, round bodies unnaturally fast, as if something far more sinister controlled them. Mark backed up into one of the machines, his flashlight flickering wildly. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." Abby stumbled, dropping her flashlight, and as it rolled across the floor, she saw something horrifying. The Squishmallows weren't just moving on their own. They were changing. Their cute embroidered faces stretched into grotesque, twisted smiles, and their soft, squishy forms seemed to grow sharper, harder, as if they were no longer made of plush, but something far more solid, something dangerous. One of the Squishmallows, a pumpkin-headed one, lunged at Abby, its mouth opening wider than any toy should be able to. She screamed, kicking it away, but more of them closed in. Jenna's camera was still rolling as she tried to make a break for the exit, but the Squishmallows blocked the door, piling up on one another until there was no way out. The laughter grew deafening, and in the dim light of her camera screen, Jenna now saw something truly chilling. Shadows, long and distorted, moving among the toys as if the souls of the cursed were still trapped within their plush bodies. Suddenly, the lights flashed back on, blindingly bright, and everything stopped. The Squishmallows lay still on the floor, their twisted faces returned to normal. The factory was silent. Breathing heavily, the three friends stood frozen, unsure of what just happened. Jenna looked down at her camera, still recording, but the footage was corrupted, filled with static and distorted images. "Let's get out of here," Mark muttered, his face pale. None of them argued. They ran out of the factory, slamming the rusted doors behind them. The rain had stopped, and the night was eerily quiet as they hurried back to the car. As they drove away in silence, Jenna glanced into the back seat and froze. There, sitting neatly in the center, was the black cat Squishmallow with the orange eyes. Its face was no longer cute. It was smiling. The Haunting of the Squishmallow Shelf. There once was a girl named Ellie who adored her Squishmallows. She had an entire shelf filled with them, soft, colorful, and each with its own quirky personality. They brought her comfort on stormy nights and kept her company when she felt alone. But as Halloween approached, something began to change. It started on a crisp October evening when Ellie returned home from school. She noticed her favorite Squishmallow, a fluffy blue dragon named Dusk, wasn't in its usual spot. She checked under the bed, around her room, even in her backpack, but Dusk was nowhere to be found. Shrugging it off, she figured she must have misplaced it. The next night, another Squishmallow went missing, an orange cat named Poppy. Ellie was more concerned now. She distinctly remembered placing Poppy right next to Dusk. As she sat on her bed, scanning the shelf, she was aware the remaining Squishmallows were looking back at her, their round eyes following her every move. She laughed at herself, chalking it up to her imagination. But the disappearances continued. Every night, one more Squishmallow was gone. Ellie was now down to just 3. That night, she decided to stay awake and keep watch. She tucked herself under the covers, her eyes barely peeking out as she stared at the shelf, determined to find out where her beloved plushies were going. The clock ticked past midnight when she saw it, a shadow shifting in the moonlight. At first she thought it was just the tree outside, but then she saw a small figure moving at the end of her bed. She gasped as she saw Dusk, her missing dragon Squishmallow, waddling across the floor, its tiny, stretched wings flapping slightly. Ellie froze, unable to believe what she was seeing. She watched as Dusk approached the shelf where the remaining Squishmallow sat perfectly still. Suddenly, the others began to move too. Poppy, the orange cat, slid down from the shelf, followed by the rest of them, their plush bodies eerily coming to life. They gathered in a circle at the center of her room, forming what looked like some kind of weird, squishy, soft ritual. Ellie couldn't move or make a sound as the Squishmallows began to chant in small, muffled voices, their eyes now glowing faintly in the dark. The temperature in the room dropped, and Ellie could feel a cold shiver run down her spine. Suddenly, a faint, ghostly figure appeared in the center of the Squishmallow circle. It was a small child, transparent and shimmering with a soft blue light. The child looked at Ellie with sad, hollow eyes. "They were mine," the ghost child whispered. "Before you found them, they were mine." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. "You took them from me, and now I want them back." The Squishmallows began to rise, slowly floating toward the ghostly figure, their soft bodies drifting through the air as if carried by an invisible wind. Ellie could only watch as each one vanished into the child's arms, disappearing one by one. When the last Squishmallow was gone, the room was silent. The child's sad eyes softened, and with a final glance at Ellie, they too faded away, leaving the room as empty and cold as it had been moments before. The next morning, Ellie's shelf was completely bare. Every last Squishmallow had disappeared without a trace. But from that night on, she could sometimes hear faint giggles in the stillness of her room, like the soft laughter of a child reunited with their long-lost friends. And Ellie? She never bought another Squishmallow again. The Midnight Squishmallow Swap. Mia had always been a collector. She loved Squishmallows, especially the rare ones that were hard to find. Her room was filled with them, lined neatly on her shelf, each one special in its own way. She would spend hours rearranging them, admiring her collection, but one particular Squishmallow was her favorite, a limited edition black bat named Midnight. Its wings were dark as the night, and its tiny, fanged smile was oddly comforting. As Halloween neared, Mia noticed something strange. Every morning when she woke up, the Squishmallow seemed slightly out of place. At first, it was just small things. A Squishmallow turned a little to the left, or one tilted slightly forward. She assumed it was her younger brother playing a prank. But one night, after rearranging the plushies for the 100th time, she decided to test her theory. She lined them up perfectly and took a photo before going to bed. That way, she could be sure. At exactly midnight, Mia woke with a start. There was no noise, no disturbance, yet something felt off. She glanced over at her shelves, and in the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window, she noticed something odd. Midnight, her favorite Squishmallow, was missing. Her heart pounded as she threw off her covers and padded over to the shelf. She scanned the room but didn't see it anywhere. A shuffling noise came from behind her. Slowly, she turned and gasped. Midnight was in the center of her room, standing upright. Mia froze. Squishmallows weren't supposed to stand on their own. She blinked, trying to convince herself she was still dreaming. But Midnight was clearly there, wobbling slightly as if held by some invisible hands. She reached out to grab it, but before she could touch it, a soft giggle echoed through the room. Mia whipped around, her heart racing. The room was empty. When she turned back, Midnight was gone. In its place stood a different Squishmallow, one she had never seen before. It was a deep red owl, its eyes wide and glittering unnervingly in the dim light. Confused, Mia picked it up. It was warm, much warmer than a Squishmallow should be. The tag on it read Sable, but Mia knew this wasn't part of her collection. She would have remembered this eerie creature. As she examined Sable, another giggle rang out, this time louder. The room seemed to grow colder. Mia's breath caught in her throat as shelves began to rattle. One by one, her Squishmallows started to topple off the shelf, landing in a pile at her feet. She watched in horror as they began to squirm, their soft plush bodies twitching and wriggling. One by one, they stood upright, their beady eyes glowing in the dark. They started moving, slowly at first, but then faster, forming a circle around her. Mia's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. The Squishmallows began to close in, their little hands reaching out toward her, and that's when she heard it again, the giggling. But this time, it came from right behind her. Mia turned slowly and gasped. Standing there was a girl about her age, but something was wrong. The girl's skin was pale, her eyes dark hollows, and her smile was too wide. She was holding Midnight in her hands. "These were mine once," the girl whispered, her voice echoing like a cold wind. "I want them back." Mia stumbled backward, tripping over the Squishmallows at her feet. The girl's eyes glowed a faint red as she took a step forward. and the Squishmallows moved with her, closing the circle around Mia. In a panic, Mia grabbed the closest Squishmallow, Sable, and held it tight. The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the girl stepped closer. "You can keep Sable," the girl whispered, "but Midnight belongs to me." Mia nodded frantically, her eyes wide with fear. In an instant, the girl and Midnight vanished, and the room was still. The only sound was Mia's ragged breathing as the soft thud of the remaining Squishmallows collapsed back into a harmless pile. The next morning, Midnight was gone, and Sable sat in its place on the shelf. Mia never saw the ghostly girl again, but from that night on, the Squishmallows never moved on their own again. But sometimes, when she held Sable close, she swore she could hear the faintest sound of a distant giggle. The Squishmallow Collector. There was a small toy shop at the edge of town, known for carrying the rarest and most unique Squishmallows. For collectors like Emma, it was a dream come true. Every month, the shopkeeper would announce a new shipment and collectors would line up early, eager to snag the newest editions. But as Halloween approached, something strange began to happen. One chilly October afternoon, Emma visited the shop in hopes of finding something special for her collection. The shelves were filled with the usual adorable Squishmallows, but at the very back of the store, a new shelf caught her eye. The Squishmallows there were unlike anything she'd ever seen. They were darker, muted colors of purples, blacks, and greens with stitched-up smiles and hauntingly wide eyes. They didn't look like the typical Squishmallows she loved, but there was something about them that drew her in. The shopkeeper, a strange old woman with pale skin and thin, bony hands, noticed Emma's gaze. "Ah, you've found the Midnight collection," she said in a raspy voice. "Special editions, very rare. Each one is one of a kind." Emma's eyes lit up. "I'll take one," she said, eagerly pointing to a small, shadowy fox Squishmallow with glittering silver eyes. The shopkeeper smiled, but her eyes held something unreadable. "That one? Be careful, child. This collection is different. They have a way of coming to life, especially around Halloween." Emma laughed it off. "Sure, I'll take it." That night, she placed the new Squishmallow, whom she named Whisper, at the center of her shelf, surrounded by her other plush friends. Whisper looked out of place among the cheerful colors and bright patterns, but Emma loved how unique it was. As she turned off the light and climbed into bed, she couldn't help but feel like Whisper's silver eyes were still watching her. At around midnight, Emma was jolted awake by a soft, rustling sound. She sat up, her heart pounding, listening closely. The room was silent, but something felt wrong. Slowly, she turned to face her shelf. Her blood ran cold. Whisper was gone. Emma rubbed her eyes, thinking she must be imagining it. But as her eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing near her bedroom door. Whisper stood upright, its silver eyes glinting in the dim light, staring straight at her. Before Emma could react, she noticed something even stranger. The rest of her Squishmallows had moved too. They stood in a line behind Whisper, their normally cute and happy faces now twisted into eerie, stitched smiles. Her heart raced as she slid out of bed and backed away. This isn't real," she whispered to herself. But the Squishmallows didn't stop. Slowly, they started to move toward her, their little feet shuffling silently across the floor. Emma reached for her phone to turn on the flashlight, but the moment the light hit them, the Squishmallows froze. Their eyes, which had been dull and lifeless before, seemed to glow faintly. The darkness in the room grew heavier, pressing down on her as a low whispering sound filled the air. "You took us home," a voice hissed, soft and eerie. Emma's heart nearly stopped. The voice seemed to come from Whisper, though its stitched mouth hadn't moved. "Now we're taking you." Emma stumbled backward, her mind racing. She had to be dreaming. This couldn't be happening. But as the Squishmallows advanced, the air around them seemed to ripple, growing colder. The whispers grew louder, and the room seemed to spin. Suddenly, the door to her bedroom slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emma yelped and turned to face it, but when she looked back, the Squishmallows were gone. Every single one of them had vanished. The room was empty except for Whisper, who now sat in the middle of the floor, staring up at her with those unsettling silver eyes. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she approached Whisper cautiously. She knelt down and picked it up, her hands trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, and the Squishmallow felt like any other, soft, plush, and harmless. Then a cold breeze blew through the room, though her windows were closed. Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as a new voice whispered from the shadows, this one low and echoing.
The collector comes for you.
Before she could react, the door to her room creaked open. Standing in the doorway was the shopkeeper from earlier that day, her bony hands clutching the doorframe. But her face was no longer human. It was pale and hollow like something long dead.
You chose one from my midnight collection,
the shopkeeper rasped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard.
Now you belong to it.
Emma tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the flicker of silver in Whisper's eyes before the room went dark. The next morning, her parents found her room completely empty. The only thing left was a single Squishmallow sitting on the bed, Whisper, with a new addition, a small stitched smile that hadn't been there before. And no one ever saw Emma again. The Curse of the Forgotten Squishmallow. It was a week before Halloween when Sophie discovered a Squishmallow she had forgotten about, stuffed in the back of her closet. She had so many over the years, collecting them from every corner of the city, that sometimes one or two would get misplaced. This one, however, was different. The Squishmallow was old, much older than the others. Its color was faded, a dull grayish purple, and its eyes weren't the usual cute Squishmallow eyes. Instead, they were glossy, almost lifeless, with small cracks running through them. The tag was long gone, and Sophie couldn't even remember its name or where she had gotten it. What happened to you? Sophie murmured as she examined the worn plush. It looked like it had been forgotten for years. Feeling guilty, she decided to clean it up and put it back on her shelf with the rest of her collection. That night, after carefully arranging her plushies, Sophie felt good about restoring the forgotten Squishmallow to its rightful place. She went to bed, comforted by the sight of her soft collection sitting neatly on their shelf, watching over her as always. But as the moon climbed high into the sky and the shadows in her room grew long, something strange happened. Sophie awoke to the sound of soft, muffled whispers. At first she thought it was just the wind, but as she sat up in bed, the whispers grew clearer, like a voice was speaking in another room. She glanced around, but nothing seemed out of place until she looked at her Squishmallow shelf. The forgotten Squishmallow was missing. Her heart skipped a beat as she slowly got out of bed and crept toward the shelf. Every plush was in its place, but the old one, the grayish cracked one, had vanished. A soft thump echoed from the hallway just outside her door. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She slowly opened her bedroom door, and there, in the dim light, she saw it. The old Squishmallow was sitting in the hallway, staring at her with those cracked glass eyes. Her skin prickled. She stepped back, but the moment she did, she saw something even more disturbing. The Squishmallow wasn't sitting alone. Behind it, barely visible in the shadows, were the faint outlines of small, soft figures. Other Squishmallows, but they didn't belong to her. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her like a cold wind.
Forgotten.
The voices chanted in unison, low and eerie.
Forgotten, but not gone.
Sophie backed away into her room, slamming the door shut. Her heart pounded as she leaned against the door, trying to convince herself this was all in her head. She grabbed her phone to turn on the light, but her fingers trembled too much to unlock the screen. Suddenly, the door creaked open behind her, though she knew she had locked it. Sophie turned slowly, her body frozen with fear. The forgotten Squishmallow was now inside her room, sitting in the middle of the floor. But it wasn't alone. The faint figures from the hallway, plush and shadowy, slipped in behind it one by one, filling the room with their eerie presence. They were old, worn Squishmallows, some of them misshapen, others with missing eyes or torn seams. The voices grew louder, and Sophie realized the whispers were coming from the Squishmallows themselves.
"We were left behind,"
the voices hissed.
"Forgotten, abandoned."
Sophie backed up against the wall, her legs shaking. "I didn't forget you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." The old Squishmallow's glass eyes glinted in the moonlight, and it began to move. Slowly, it dragged itself across the floor, pulling its limp body close to her. The other Squishmallows followed, their soft forms gliding eerily across the ground. Sophie's breath quickened as the plush figures began to surround her, their small hands brushing against her legs, their eyes glinting with a strange, unsettling light. She could feel the coldness of their presence, the weight of their forgotten past pressing down on her. The old Squishmallow spoke again, but this time the voice was different, clearer, more human. "You left us to rot," it whispered, "but now we're taking you with us." Before Sophie could scream, the Squishmallows lunged, their plush forms wrapping around her limbs, their soft hands pulling her down to the floor. The room spun, and she felt the coldness seep into her skin, her vision blurring as the world around her grew darker and darker. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the old Squishmallow's cracked eyes staring down at her, unblinking. The next morning, Sophie's parents found her room empty. The only sign that she had ever been there was her Squishmallow collection, neatly arranged on the shelf, except for one new addition. An old, worn-out Squishmallow with dull, grayish-purple fur, its glassy eyes cracked and lifeless. And no one ever spoke of Sophie again. One cold autumn night, a group of friends, obsessed with the newest ghost hunting craze, decided to venture into an abandoned mansion on the edge of town. The mansion had a history, a dark one, rumored to have been home to a reclusive toy maker who mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind unfinished projects. One of those projects? Squishmallows. But these weren't your typical plush toys. The friends were a quirky bunch, one always filming for their TikTok account, another obsessed with cute plushies like Squishmallows, and the rest eager for a thrill. They had heard rumors that the mansion's basement held hundreds of Squishmallows, never sold, left to collect dust. The thought of these squishy creatures just sitting there, unloved and forgotten, drew them in. The air grew colder as they entered the mansion, flashlights flickering against the cracked walls. A chill ran down their spines, but they laughed it off, excitement masking their fear. They ventured deeper down creaky stairs into the basement, where the air felt heavy with something wrong. The basement door opened with a groan, and there they were, piles of Squishmallows, soft, cute, and perfectly squishy, just as they had imagined. But something felt off. As they stepped closer, they noticed some of the Squishmallows had faintly glowing eyes, and a cold, sinister feeling crept into the room. One of the friends picked one up, a cute, ghost-shaped Squishmallow, only for its eyes to flicker and it seemed to blink. Startled, they dropped it, and as it hit the floor, a soft giggle echoed through the room, though no one was laughing. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, suffocating. The Squishmallows around them began to move, shifting slightly, ever so subtly. First, they thought it was their imagination. But then the toys started to drag themselves closer. One of them screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Without warning, one of the friends was yanked backward by an unseen force, vanishing into the pile of plushies. The others scrambled to the exit, but it was as if the room itself had changed, warping into an endless labyrinth of Squishmallows, their squishy bodies now far from cute, more like suffocating masses that blocked every exit. The friends tried to stick together, but in the chaos, they were separated, swallowed by the sea of possessed Squishmallows. The last thing they heard was that same eerie giggling, followed by a soft voice that whispered, "Now you're ours forever, Squishy." The next day, the mansion stood as it always had, silent and abandoned. But if you listen closely on quiet nights, you can hear muffled voices crying out from within the piles of Squishmallows, forever trapped, forever hunted by the cute yet sinister toys they once adored. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed the spooky Squishmallow stories. I hope you're having a great spooky season, And I want to wish you all happy, happy Halloween. If you did enjoy the video, please click the like button. It helps me out in the YouTube universe. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. I would really, 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 really appreciate it. And if you want to be one of the first GlitterBugs to know when I post a new video, please click the notification bell. Alright guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I love you all so much. And I will see you very, very, very soon. Happy Halloween.